Chapter 7 of Recollections of a Missionary in the Great West by Cyrus Townsend Brady. Recording is in the public domain. One day on the Frisco road the engine broke down. It was a freight train and I was the only passenger, consequently I went out and worked with the train crew, pulling and heaving and hauling with the rest. I knew something about the principles of mechanics, and was familiar with the machine as well, being quite capable of running the engine myself, and was therefore able to advise them to some purpose. The work was carried on under a vigorous and uninterrupted flow of profanity, profusely and picturesquely weird in the highest degree. It was not so shocking as it might be under other circumstances, for I knew the men meant nothing by it, that it was only a matter of habit with them, as it is with 90 people out of 100 who are guilty of the same bad practice. Finally I suggested an interruption in the swearing, as I was a preacher. The head brakeman dropped his crowbar with a look of abject astonishment. Everybody else let go at the same time, and the engine settled down again. They looked at me in consternation, which was very amusing. "Hell and blazes!" said the conductor, "you are a what?" "A preacher," I replied. "Well, I'm damned," he answered, with a long whistle of astonishment. He regarded me thoughtfully for a moment, and finally said, "Well, sir, you work like a man, anyway. Catch hold again." "All right," I answered, smiling at his frankness, "but no more swearing on this trip." "Nope," was the laconic reply, and the promise was kept. At the close of our manoeuvres, when we all stood, panting but successful, the engineer remarked, "Well, it's the first time I ever saw a preacher that knowed a reversing lever from a box car before. Come up and ride with me the rest of the way." Aside from his profanity, I found him a pleasant and interesting companion, and whenever I made the town at the end of his run, he never failed to come to church. On that same train, earlier in the day, I rode for a long distance alone with a living interrogation point. As I am something of an interrogation point myself, as far as regards men from whom I make a practice of constantly seeking to acquire information on the subjects they know, we clashed considerably. Just before he got off he was speaking of some friend of his, and said in a very naive way, "Yes, John is a very different man from me. We ain't one bit alike, and John is one of the most honest men I ever knew." I was glad, after that statement, that he did not try to borrow $1 from me before he left. Speaking of a most honest man reminds me of another old friend of mine, who rejoiced under the peculiar name of Orsimus Stocum. Once, when referring to a sermon he had heard me preach, he remarked that it was a very good sermon, but pretty middlin' long, and he thought I must 'a' got awful tired preachin' it. I had. I did not always meet with pleasant receptions at new places, and I was warned on one occasion that no services were desired, and that none would be permitted, and that if I consulted my own interests and the interests of peace and harmony, which I was supposed to promote, I would stay away. Of course, after that, nothing on earth could keep a man from going to just that place. On my arrival I was met by a large body of citizens who had no interest either in me or in religion, but who were determined to see fair play. They escorted me to a hotel, had secured a vacant store building, and were all ready for trouble if those whom they called the anti-religious faction desired to make any. In fact, I think they were thirsting for trouble. There were no women at services that night. Nothing but men and guns. I did not feel particularly cheerful, but managed to get through some way, and tried somehow or other to win over the opposing faction, so that in subsequent visits guns would be laid aside. But we had no trouble, and I managed to get hold of them all eventually, so that my truculent escort was dispensed with in future visits, and the women came to church. When once you get the friendship of those frontiersmen, you are all right. You can say anything to them. But they are so very hasty with their weapons that frequently you do not have an opportunity to get properly introduced. Later, at this very town, I was present at a little entertainment given for the benefit of the church, and it was certainly entertaining. There were no programs, so just before the curtain rose an embarrassed young man came out on the stage and stated that there was to be a Queen of Fame who had a laurel wreath which she would award to the most correctly represented historical character present. He closed with this sentence: "The curtain will now raise, then the characters come in, one by one, and each particular character says what is or her particular claim to this here wreath." The curtain rose, the goddess appeared, and then the characters, particular and otherwise, made their appearance before her. It was indescribably funny. Isaac Walton was dressed in a pair of patent wading boots and a cork helmet, Pocahontas flirting with a Japanese fan, Michelangelo in a bicycle suit and a gray wig and beard, Xantippe wearing a red cheesecloth waist, tight-fitting, with apron and white mob cap, and carrying a fire shovel with which to coerce the unfortunate Socrates, who was gloomily enshrouded in an appropriate black domino. N.B. The costumes were not meant to be burlesque, and the whole thing was serious, very serious to the performers, and mainly so to the audience, except to me. Diogenes was wrapped in a Navajo blanket, Leif Ericson was dressed in an astonishing costume decorated with feathers and scalps, his feet covered with Indian moccasins, and a lady's white ruche tied round each ankle. Emma Abbott, Nielsen, and Jenny Lind each sang songs. Joan of Arc appeared in knickerbockers and boots, carrying the cover of a wash boiler. Miriam led her Jewish maidens on deck, one of them merrily playing on a banjo, and so on. During the intermission, as this was professedly a semi-religious affair, the orchestra, which consisted of 2 fiddles and a horn, played an anthem, and finished with the Hallelujah chorus, the Alleluia portion being taken by the melancholy trombone. I said at the close that I had learned more in one brief evening than I ever thought possible. I knew more about ancient costumes than ever before. This is a description of one of the most primitive towns I ever ministered to, which I take from a letter written at the time. It is a frontier cattle town of the kind you read about in dime novels, if you ever read any. It consists of one long straggling street, lined on both sides with frame stores, saloons, and gambling dens, mostly unpainted. There are 12 saloons on the street, and only about 300 people in the town. Faro, keno, craps, and every other kind of gambling games are going on at full blast and with no attempt at concealment. There every man you meet carries a .45, i.e., a .45 caliber revolver, and a belt of cartridges at his waist. I stayed at the Grand Central. The magnificence of the name and the comforts of the hotel are in an inverse ratio to each other. The rooms are tiny, and the partitions thin boards or canvas screens. Therefore the conversations are audible and forcible. I asked for toast last night at supper, and had the pleasure of hearing the cook inquire, "What in does a dude preacher want toast at night for? Tell him he can't have it. I ain't giving out no toast to nobody at this hour." If I had known how he would have taken it, I would have starved before I asked for it. There is not a tree in the town, and no grass. I know places where not even the cottonwood would grow, in spite of the fact that the ground around the trees for 10 feet in every direction was plowed up and watered regularly. The streets are as hard as iron. It has not rained for months. Water, however, does not appear to be in demand. Very few drink it, and not many wash. The day before I arrived 3 desperadoes broke out of the jail after killing a guard, armed themselves, and fled. The sheriff and a posse made up of all the male citizens and a few of the female immediately started in pursuit, overtook them, fought them, killed 2 of them, and wounded another desperately. One of the deputy sheriffs had his arm blown off in the fight. This was looked upon as quite an ordinary affair, exciting little comment, and only elicited a brief notice in the weekly newspaper, with a significant warning to the rest of the prisoners in the jail to stay there until they were released. I should think they would stay. I never felt so peaceable in my life. I really have no desire to quarrel with any one. The church is an unceiled, unsheathed wooden building, unpainted also, the only church in town. Everybody, nearly, comes to church to services. They look upon it as an intellectual diversion, perhaps, and as a relief from the monotony of faro, at which they always lose. This morning, while waiting for service time, I stood in the big general store and watched the scene. It struck me as something incongruous to see a 6-foot man, bearded like the pard, with a mustache fierce enough for Don César de Bazan, with a red flannel shirt on and armed with the usual .45, selling baby clothes. It amused me inwardly, but I assure you I was grave outwardly. As I stood by and watched the transaction I could not have expressed my real feelings for the whole store. Most of the clerks were as piratical looking as the one mentioned, and most of the customers ditto. There was a street fight this morning between two ruffians about a claim, in which one was badly used up. The monotony of the landscape was also broken by the attempt of a famous buck jumper to conquer an equally famous bronco. The man finally won, but it was after a struggle which almost beggars description. They tell me that it is very quiet here, and that I should see the city on Saturday and Sunday, when the boys are in from the range. Heaven forbid! It has been bitter cold all day and night, and is about 100 degrees this morning. The wind blew a simoon from the south all day Thursday, and it was as hot as India's coral strand. On Friday a norther swept down upon us, and the temperature makes one think of Greenland's icy mountains. The inhabitants themselves remind me of another line of that old missionary hymn. We know not what the weather will be later on, it has not yet developed. Many of the inhabitants live in dugouts, some in sod houses, with here and there a lonesome, staring, ambitious, wretched little Queen Anne cottage unpainted. This did not seem a very promising field for the church, yet we subsequently succeeded in establishing services, and now the mission is thriving and the character of the town is entirely changed. One of my Sunday circuits necessitated a start from my home at 1 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. By continuous traveling I would reach my first point at 7 o'clock Sunday morning. Services were at 7:30 in a pretty little farm church several miles from the station, built right out in the fields. This church was afterwards destroyed by a cyclone. The farmers who made up the congregation had no money, but they had land, and they each one of them planted 1 acre of their best land in wheat, which was to be harvested and sold for the new church. The crops failed. Next year they planted 2 acres. The crops failed again. And the third year they planted 3 acres, and had a fine harvest, the proceeds of which they religiously set aside for the new church building fund, which presently enabled them to replace the wrecked building. Such perseverance I have not often seen. Every time they lost they doubled the stakes on the Lord's side till they won. After that early service, which, be it remembered, they only had once in about 5 or 6 weeks, I drove or rode to a little town 9 miles away. The church people in that town were of a different sort, and I frequently had to sweep and dust out the building, and in winter kindle the fire myself, besides ringing the church bell, which was a very large hand affair, such as auctioneers or small restaurant keepers use. I have often stood on the street and swung that bell until I could gather some sort of a congregation. This was only at first, however, for later the people waked up and did what was proper. When that service was over I would get a lunch packed in a little basket. At first I had it packed at a hotel, but afterwards the people did it for me, and very nice lunches they were. Armed with my little basket, I would drive 12 miles to another town, holding a service there about 2 o'clock, after which I would take the afternoon train for my fourth station and service at night. Sometimes, not always, but almost every other time, I would have to ride between 20 and 30 miles to catch another train, and this would compel me to get up about 2 o'clock in the morning. Those were hustling times. Though an Eastern man, I learned to hustle with the rest, so much so, in fact, that I have never been able to get out of the habit, and I was recently told, therefore, that I was too Western for a civilized diocese. Speaking of lunches put up for me, nothing could exceed the generosity of the people with what they had. I used to reach home generally feeling and looking like a truck wagon. Pots of jam, the omnipresent preserves — they were worse on preserves out there than a New Englander is with his pie — jars of pickled onions, fruit, loaves of homemade bread — I carried them all home. But my crowning achievement was the transportation of several pounds of scrapple for 5 days over 1,000 miles of country. There was only one place in 80,000 square miles of territory in which that delectable compound was made, by an old Pennsylvania friend of mine, and I was determined to get it home. I succeeded, but the oleaginous concoction ruined my grip. One of the churches I mentioned a moment since had been built by an English farm colony, which, as its members knew nothing of farming, came quickly to grief. The pretty little building stood alone on the prairie, utterly useless. One fine day we raised it on wheels, hitched teams to it, and hauled it some 20 miles over the prairie — fortunately there were no watercourses intervening — to a little town, where it found a permanent abiding place, and did good service. We often moved church buildings over the country, following the people after busted booms had forced them into other localities. When I stayed longer than an hour or two in any place, I always told the people to have as many services as they liked, that I would conduct them and preach at all of them. As many of them only had services when I would come to them, once every 6 weeks or so, they often availed themselves of my permission, and sometimes astonished me by the number of occasions for preaching and services that were invented. After I had succeeded in working up 2 or 3 missions in any neighborhood to a partially self-supporting basis, the bishop would get a little money from the East and add to it what the people could provide, and we would put a resident missionary in the field. In fact, that was my chief duty. I was only to break up the ground and prepare the way — a sort of ecclesiastical pioneer. But there were some places that were too poor or too far away ever to be combined, and these I took care of all the time. Train robberies and bank robberies were frequent. We were used to them. I remember the wife and daughter of a friend of mine, an army officer stationed on the frontier, were going East. As the train started out of Chicago, they heard sounds like pistol shots from the roadside. The woman and her daughter immediately dropped to the floor between the seats of the Pullman, and crouched down, remaining thus concealed until they saw they were attracting a great deal of attention from the amused passengers. When they were asked for an explanation of their singular conduct, they could only say that they thought that it was a hold up of the train, and they were doing as they had been taught. I was at Coffeyville a day or two after the famous raid by the Daltons, in which all the raiders were killed except one, who was desperately wounded and captured. In the action several of the citizens lost their lives as well. The town for months after was in a state of siege. Every man had a Winchester in his office or store, and it was almost as much as his life was worth for a suspicious character to enter a bank. Revolvers were sprinkled everywhere. In one little town, where there was but one bank, 2 men rode into town in the morning, walked into the bank, shot the president dead, mortally wounded the cashier, the clerk, fortunately for him, being at the post office. The men seized all the available cash inside the counter and rode off. They were immediately pursued by the citizens, led by the city marshal. The robbers, hard pressed, took shelter in a coulee or gully. They had chosen a strong position for defense, and had put one or two bullets into some careless and reckless citizens before they were discovered. The coulee, which was a very short one filled with dry wood and underbrush, was immediately surrounded by the posse. After a consultation they sent back to town for several barrels of oil, which they poured down the ravine from the hill, or the inside in, and then set fire to the mass. The bank robbers stood it as long as they could, and came staggering out of the opening, blinded by the smoke, firing irregularly. They wounded one man, but were promptly lassoed and deprived of their weapons. Trial was dispensed with, and the prisoners were mounted on the tail of a wagon, a noose was cast about each man's neck, and the ends of the ropes fastened to the limb of a stumpy tree. "Got anything to say before you die?" asked the marshal grimly. "Nothin'," said the leader of the band of two, a boy of 21 years of age. "We did it. I shot the cashier myself. We'll show you that we ain't afraid of you. We only want you to tell the boys that we died game." "We'll do it," said the marshal, appreciatively. "Get up," he laconically shouted to the bronco, and that was all. That was the town in which I buried the daughter of the king of whom I told you. Chapter 8